delighted to be here, and thank you for having me. I'm part of the Physicians Association for Nutrition. As you can see, our name and our various logos and icons and so on. Um, and here you, um, well, this is really you and me. So UCSD, happy to be here again. And I am Medical Executive Director for the Physicians Association for Nutrition for the US. We are an international organization, and I also do some work beyond the States in terms of both fundraising and growing our work around the world, both in Europe and now more and more in the global South countries. We are all about whole food plant-based nutrition, the benefits, the health aspects, and we're all about the science. And there's my contact info. I'll flip it up at the very end as well. If anybody wants to give me a holler, a shout out, that's my email address and my landline and my mobile. I am a pediatrician, although this talk isn't aimed only around children, obviously. And I've done a lot of primary care work, pediatric emergency medicine. I have had leadership roles with hospitals and health plans. Was CEO of a health plan for the poor in Massachusetts for 6 years. And for a number of years, I've worked with medical and humanitarian and animal protection charities. And my main gig right now is PAN, Physicians Association for Nutrition, and the work we do around whole food plant-based nutrition. I would add that I have been myself vegetarian for probably 30 years and totally plant-based vegan for 18 years, and have been attentive to a especially healthy whole food plant-based diet for the last 4 or 5 years, I'd say. Um, so this is what we'll talk about today. You can see I've highlighted in green. I want to spend most of our energy on myths of vegan diets, micro and macronutrients, both proteins and B12 and D, and all of that. But a few words first about lifestyle medicine more broadly. I'll say a few words about climate. I'm not here to be your um, climate and agriculture expert. You may hear that from others, but I thought a little bit of time there would make sense. Sometime on power of nutrition, our language about um, really the value, the human health value of plant-based nutrition. Again, we'll spend most of our time on vegan diets and nutrients. Since I am a doctor, I'll say a few words about clinicians, physicians, and other health professionals, most of whom are um, somewhat ignorant of plant-based diets and sometimes unsupportive. And at the very end, I'll say a few more words about PAN, my parent organization. So let's get started. So lifestyle medicine first. If you think about sort of the broader universe, a healthy diet, highlighted on the bottom, predominantly whole food plant-based, is a key attribute of lifestyle medicine about our staying healthy for ourselves, for our family, for our friends, our classmates, our colleagues, and so on. Other attributes of lifestyle medicine that for a population basis and raise each of our odds individually, that we will live a long and healthy life, and not just a number of years, but healthy, active years that may feel less connected to people who are young, but we all age, and staying healthy is obviously without health there's really nothing. So other attributes of lifestyle medicine, of being healthy for life, aside from diet, which of course is the main subject today, life purpose, having meaning in life, having a sense of community, peers, friends, family, and so on. Stress management. I meditate most days, and that it's been a useful tool for me. And I also work with a charity, Dharma Voices for Animals, whose mission is to support Buddhists in following their faith belief, which is to cause no harm to sentient beings, all sentient beings, and that's really enabled me to engage on a lot of the secular aspects of Buddhism, mindfulness, meditation, and the like. Um, Good sleep and low alcohol, ETOH, alcohol intake. So I was an undergraduate once a million years ago, and good sleep and low alcohol consumption probably weren't the highest on my list, but I just mentioned this as long-term lifestyle attributes. And current recommendations are that used to be, people would say, experts would say in medicine, that women shouldn't have more than one drink a day and men no more than two. And now it's none of us should have more than one drink a day, since alcohol is not good for the brain and raises the risk of many cancers, GI tract, including colon, breast, prostate, and so on. Exercise, well, we all know that's important, and so I won't belabor that here today. And our main focus today is a healthy diet, predominantly whole food, plant-based. People come to vegan diets, as you know as well as I do, from any combination of interest in one's own health, in the ethical aspects, the compassion aspects towards our fellow earth creatures, and towards the environment. And sometimes there's a social justice aspect as well in terms of people that work in agriculture. We'll talk some more about that in a minute. The American College of Lifestyle Medicine, which is, for health professionals primarily, it's a really, really good place to engage around the aspects of lifestyle medicine. I'm, happy to be a member, and there's the website. Okay, next are blue zones. So blue zones are areas of the world where people are, I'm in Boston, so I'll use an occasional Bostonism, but where people are wicked healthy, as we say on the other end of the continent. And so one is not far from, some of you may be scattered around the country and the world now, given the pandemic, but I'll refer to San Diego as home base for the audience today. And so Loma Linda is probably 100 miles north, if I remember the geo, up the I-15, and not far from you. But so it's a blue zone in the States, and you can see some of the others in Costa Rica, southern Italy, Greece, Okinawa, and so these are areas where people live longer and live healthier, and we'll explore that for a minute to help to make the intro points about this talk. So in blue zones, there's much higher longevity on a population basis. The average person lives more than 10 years, lives greater than 10 years from their expected actuarial longevity, which is huge on a population basis. There are many more, I always have trouble saying the word, but centenarians, people that live to be 100 or more. There are many, many more people that live into their second century in blue zones than elsewhere. Much lower mortality for people in their 40s, 50s, 60s from heart attacks, strokes, cancer, and the rest than age and gender adjusted cohorts, and much lower rates of dementia, Alzheimer's, and otherwise. So these people are, in fact, wicked healthy. Separated around the world in these pockets, but what's strikingly similar in blue zones, given wildly different lifestyle behaviors, is diet and a predominance of whole food, plant-based, nutrition-centric diets. So Loma Linda, which makes sense to speak to, especially because it's close to home and it's the one blue zone in North America. There's a study. So Seventh-day Adventists are a faith-based community. You may know of them, and maybe one or two of you are members of the faith. That part of their faith tradition is to eat a vegetarian or vegan diet, and of course some do and some don't, like any faith tradition. But probably about half of Seventh-day Adventists eat a vegetarian or vegan diet, which of course is wildly larger than for the general North American or Western population. A study was done not too many years ago, looked at 100,000 people over time, about 50,000 vegetarian or vegan, and about 50,000 also Seventh-day Adventists, but not vegetarian and vegan. So a huge population study over time. No matter the cholesterol level, the diabetes status, blood pressure, or any metabolic clinical findings, on a population basis, with this population, vegetarians and vegans have lower health risks. Also, in terms of weight being an issue for health, and also for just how we feel about ourselves, and not to shame people who are overweight, of course, but maintaining one's weight in a healthy BMI is good for us. That in this 100,000 person population study over time, the closer one was to a vegan diet, the better their weight was on a gender and height adjusted basis. Cholesterol, diabetes, high blood pressure, metabolic syndrome, which is sort of like obesity pre-diabetes, will have the same trends. The closer you are diet-wise to being vegan, the lower the health risk. And for type 2 diabetes, which is epidemic in the West now, based on poor diet and obesity, the prevalence of type 2 diabetes in vegans and also in lacto-ovo vegetarians was half that, which, I'm a physician and a scientist, was half that, which is huge, striking difference. Striking. Sometimes you'll see in most clinical studies a 2%, a 5%, a 10% difference. 50% difference is huge for disease prevalence. So half as many Seventh-day Adventists in the study who were veg or vegan would have type 2 um, as people that are not. Even when one control for a socioeconomic and lifestyle. So there was lots of the sorts of things one does in a controlled medical study. You control age, gender, um, wealth, um, other behaviors that might relate to type 2. When everything that we could control was controlled, twice as much type 2 amongst non-vegetarians as vegetarians. So striking difference. All right, I'm going to segue now to the next area. This is really an overview talk, and again, we'll focus mostly on macro and micronutrients and eating a plant-based or plant-centric diet. So a few words about climate and diet, and you may well be very expert in this or have other people that speak to this, so I'll be very overview. So this is a graphic from the Center for Sustainable Systems at Michigan, go blue. And so I have, when I've shown examples from charities or academic environments, I have made a real point in this talk to not pick sort of hardcore activist charities or NGOs, but to pick those that are pretty much middle of the bell-shaped curve and just doing the science, because that's what we're doing. So if you the y-axis then are pounds of CO2 exuded into the atmosphere and for those of us, including myself, who feel compassion towards farmed animals, you'll pardon some of the language, but for the consumption of animal products here, and then plant-based products, you can see that there's the highest bar far and away on the left. Whoops, sorry. Is trying to use my cursor as a pointer. Is for beef. I don't have a bar for sheep and lamb, but that would be in between beef and cheese. Then cheese, then eating pigs, chickens mostly, ducks, geese, eggs, milk, and then almost asymptotic with the x-axis are rice, legumes, beans, lentils and peas, carrots, potatoes, and so on. So the impact on CO2 distribution into the atmosphere is strikingly several orders of magnitude different if one eats a animal-centric diet versus a plant-centric diet. It's a huge difference, as you can see. This pie graph then shows, or at least one example here from grain.org, which is another charity. It's one slice, if you will, sorry, looking at what percent of all climate change is based on animal agriculture. And you'll see numbers from 18% to over 50%. It's at least 18 to 20%. And some studies like this one talk about at least 50%. So actual agricultural production, this would be everything from gas exuded by cows to all the land that's used for soy, corn, and production and grazing and so on. Deforestation is huge, all the forest loss, so that we can graze animals and grow crops for animals. Processing, transport, packing, retail, and then some waste product, the lagoons, when you see those horrible lagoons next to pig factory farms and so on. So this effort at looking at animal ag impact on climate change says that about half is due to animal ag, and everything else is non-animal ag. The smallest numbers I've seen are 18%. There's a WHO study that says 51%. It's huge. So environmentalists are beginning to come around to the importance of eating a plant-based diet to mitigate the impact of climate change. There's progress and a long ways to go, but some slow, steady progress. All right, a few other comments here outside of climate before we get to human health specifically. Well, so these are not individual health metrics, but population health measures. Antimicrobial resistance. People that get sick and the antibiotics don't work anymore. It's becoming a bigger and bigger problem in my business, in medicine. You may know this, but over 70% of all antibiotics used in North America are given to animals, pigs, cows, chickens, and others, on factory farms, not for human health and not for animal health. It's because the conditions are so terrible, as you know, that the animals are given antibiotics every day to allow them to grow faster and have less disease from the terrible crowding that they are under. And so that, of course, you have all the more antibiotics that are used for non-human health purposes, the more resistant bacteria occur. And so a leading cause of resistance. It'd be impossible to give a talk about whole food plant-based nutrition and not at least acknowledge that, oh, by the way, we are in a bad pandemic. The great majority of pandemics over time come from human interaction with animals. So it's either eating animals or deforestation. And so probably if the Chinese government is to be believed, and I don't want to get into the politics of that at all, but probably, at least based on what they're reporting, COVID-19 jumped from bats in wet markets, a term for live markets, where animals are sold to consumers still alive. Is there, some of the other pandemics recently, a number of the swine flu, a number of the flus that have killed hundreds of thousands of people. It hasn't been as bad as COVID. Come from chicken factory farming and pig factory farming, and then deforestation, which also brings animals closer to us, and then and us closer to them, and probably AIDS. Jump to humans from what's called bushmeat in sub-Saharan Africa is killing primates, eating them, and then of course from humans to other primates, the viruses travel most easily since we're so similar biologically. One of my colleagues, a great expert, Michael Greger, some of you may know of him. He's a fellow of the American College of Lifestyle Medicine, wrote How Not to Die and some other books. Founder of Nutrition Facts and a board member of my organization. If you actually want to create global pandemics, then build factory farms. Sorry. All right, power of nutrition. So a couple of quotes from the WHO. First, if the major risk factors for non-communicable diseases, NCDs, were eliminated, around 3/4 of heart disease, stroke, and type 2 would be prevented, and about 40% of cancer would be prevented. Striking numbers. And of course, most people in my profession in medicine spend much more time treating disease than being involved in preventing disease. And that's a whole nother discussion, but of course, real. NCDs are preventable through effective interventions that tackle shared risk factors. So there's, cigarette smoking and drinking booze, and not exercising, and diet. It's nothing rocket science. We know all this. So here's 4 of the 5 key plant-based nutrient groups: fruits, vegetables, nuts and seeds, whole grains. I don't have on this slide legumes, lentils, beans and peas, but you can another very non-hard-nosed advocacy. So straight and narrow Charity Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation. And so it's a little bit of a busy slide, but you can see if we use in the top left, for example, if we use apples just as an example, the average North American eats the equivalent of 1 apple a day. It could be other fruits, and the recommendations are to eat around 3. For nuts and seeds, the average North American eats about 3 grams per day, which is the equivalent to 1.5 walnut halves, nothing, right? And the recommended intake is 16 to 25 grams, so just a little bit under an ounce, so a handful. Whole grains, not that it's only whole grain bread, but as an example, the average American eats the equivalent whole grain wise. Of course, there are many other whole grains of 1 slice of bread, and 3 to 5 would be the target. And for vegetables, less bad, but for all vegetables, with carrots here as the example, the average American, North American, Canadians and Americans eat about 3 medium-sized carrots a day, and 7 would be the target. So when you look at these this graphic, there's a striking difference from recommended to actual. On the other hand, and again, the fruit and vegetable and so on shown is not, you have to eat that one. It's just an example. It's not that hard to get to recommended level. So I won't spend time here. This is a slide I use more with docs, but and you're mostly very young, but we will get old. So inflammation and aging, um, animal products, meats, um, especially when they're grilled, when they're processed, but in general, meat and both meat and then byproducts of the dairy and egg um, um, cause inflammation in our bodies, and that inflammation um, predisposes towards all these horrible diseases. Starting at the 12 o'clock, it's the Alzheimer's, other dementias, and you can go around the uh, the clock here, if you will, and see um, that inflammation predisposes to these diseases. Um, Animal products cause inflammation in our body, and whole food plant-based nutrition not only doesn't cause inflammation, it fights inflammation. It really is a 180. So I won't read through all this, but it's very real, and it's there, and it's lifetime burden. And when without getting too morbid, but when post-mortems are done on people, late teens, early 20s, that were otherwise healthy and died from sudden trauma, bad car accident, soldiers and so on, and a postmortem is done, there's already a fair amount of gunk, not a very scientific term, but a fair amount of hardening of the arteries, a fair amount of plaque already in the arteries, coronaries and otherwise. So it starts young, and then it becomes a lifetime burden. Not only does a whole food plant-based diet, WFPBD, reduce the chances of getting bad disease, can also treat disease. It's quite remarkable, quite striking. For cardiovascular disease, heart attacks, strokes, and all the rest, type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure, which is leading killer in the entire developed world, and rheumatoid arthritis, which people don't think of as much, but as well, if one has a heart attack and has some cardiac insufficiency and switches to a whole food plant-based diet, that has striking health benefit on a population basis. It's quite remarkable. And people in my business will make jokes about, well, a patient will say, well, switching to a vegan diet, well, that's that's really a crazy change. That's such a huge change. I don't know that I can do that. When the alternatives are, of course, a bunch of medications with side effects, stents on the coronary arteries, and open heart surgery, where veins are taken from the leg. Somebody is put on a bypass pump. Their chest is cracked, another clinical term, and they have bypass vessels put in their heart. So from that perspective, eating a whole food plant-based diet doesn't really seem like that dramatic a thing to do. I would also note, and many of us come to this kind of diet from a ethical and or an environmental perspective, that from a human health perspective, once one gets to 90-95% whole food plant-based, there are other reasons to be 100% vegan if one chooses that, and I have. From a human health point of view, at least right now, there's plenty of studies saying that whole food plant-based diets are way healthier than meat-based diets. There's no convincing evidence that if you get rid of the last 5, 7, maybe 10% of animal products in your diet, that has a material additional health benefit. So just to be fair and pass on the science about that. So before we get to nutrients, so there's lots and lots of plant-based, quote unquote, meats out there, and they've been around for a long time. Tofurkey and all the rest. I've eaten them for many years, and of course in the last few years there's Beyond and Impossible, which have more saturated fat than the older timey sort of hippie traditional plant-based meats, because they're made, Impossible and Beyond and so on, are made to taste more like real meat. And so one question is, are they as unhealthy as meat, or less so? There's not been a lot of medical research yet, but one really good study out of Stanford just earlier this year. So American AJCN is the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. It's a serious peer-reviewed journal, A tier. Anybody who wants to, the link is there for the study. So it's a case control study done. These are all meat eaters. Everybody ate a typical North American diet. and they were randomized, agreed to. Um, um, just sort of the key thing to do in any um, study in medicine is to have a randomized controlled trial, or else you never know for sure what change is affecting the outcome. So half the folks were put on um, 8 weeks of a regular diet, so no change, and the other half on 8 weeks of the only meat they got was plant-based meat. They ate no meat, or real meat, if you will. And then they were a case control in our public health jargon. They were switched, so the folks on a plant-based meat switched to regular meat, and the folks on regular meat switched to plant-based meat. And again, these were all people that eat meat every day. And so what was interesting and somewhat reassuring, TMAO is a marker of inflammation, and particularly cardiovascular inflammation. It's a biochemical test in medicine. LDL is bad cholesterol, low density lipoprotein, and well, weight is obvious what that is. And so the folks, the meat eaters who were put on 8 weeks of plant-based meats, had reduction in inflammation, reduction of bad cholesterol, reduction in weight. What was interesting is that because you would expect, well, they'd be 50-50, the 8 weeks on the plant-based meats, they would be in better shape than that. The group that was randomized first to plant-based meat kept much of the reduction in TMAO, the bad inflammation marker in the bloodstream, when they switched to regular meat. And so the hypothesis, and I haven't proven it, is that the getting meat out of their diet improved their gut bacteria, their microbiome, and that gave a protective effect for some period of time, at least 8 weeks, when they went back to regular meat. My own view, and of course there are ethical and environmental reasons for those of us that make those kinds of choices to not eat meat. From a human health point of view, and the science is just being developed, my own view is that these new plant-based meats like Impossible and Beyond are less bad for us than real meat, and this study shows that not as good for us as a whole food plant-based diet. And of course, everything in moderation. There's nothing wrong with having an Impossible burger once in a while, or Beyond sausage and so on, and I do that. It's in moderation. Okay, I've always wanted to, it's just my amusing myself here, but right, those of us that are entirely vegan, so first question, right, where do you get your protein from? So hardly the first speaker to use these slides, but obviously one can get enough protein from plant-based nutrition. So sorry about that, but I couldn't help but to include that slide. So we'll talk about a few common myths briefly, and then I want to talk about the nutrients, which I think is really the core of this talk. So the first two common myths, and then during the Q&A, please feel encouraged to ask me about other myths, because I'm surely missing some. So right, so one myth that you hear all the time is vegan diets aren't healthy, and then the flip side, all vegans are healthy. Well, vegan diets are one more Boston wicked. Vegan diets are wicked healthy, and on a population basis, people that eat whole food plant-based centric diets are much healthier on a population basis. Have less heart attacks, less strokes, less type 2, way less diabetes, reduction in a number of cancers, and some other inflammatory diseases like rheumatoid arthritis. Much healthier. There's no doubt about that, especially if one is eating mostly a whole food plant-based diet, and not, you can drink a lot of beer and eat sweet chili chips and Oreos, and those are vegan too. But a vegan diet, mostly whole food based, much healthier. On the other hand, no one lives forever, and vegans get sick, and so we need to be a little bit careful about. One of my dearest friends, and actually the woman who triggered me to switch 18 years ago from being veg to vegan, she has and she's been vegan forever. She has an inflammatory lupus-like disease, and so stuff happens. And if one can reduce their chances of getting a bad disease by 30 or 50 or 75%, while doing right by people, by our peers and our family, by encouraging that as well, and right by the environment, and demonstrate compassion for all, let's do it. But let's also not think that every vegan is always healthy. But it improves our odds hugely, not just getting disease, but a sense of health and well-being. So the vegans are preachy. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but it's not true. Of course, there are some of us like that. I think that a lot of that comes from um, most people's own um, um, cognitive dissonance, um, so that many people that are otherwise good-minded and have a blind spot for um, the harm that eating animals causes. Um, and I'm sure, most of us were there earlier in life, and most of us have friends and colleagues and classmates like this. It's something like, well, I'm a good person. I work for all the right causes, and I eat meat, so it must be okay to eat meat. And then when someone raises questions about eating meat, um, it's seen as being preachy. And so there's lots of tools. It's better to ask questions. It's better not to do it this way. It's better to not be preachy. It's better to encourage incremental change, um, all those sorts of things. But I just mentioned that. So vegan is white. So that's one of the. It's so interesting. I'm a white guy, and if you look at so of course there are more than two um, ethnic groups in America, um, and some cultures have um, a predominant plant-based diet to begin with, particularly people from South and East Asia. That frequently changes after a couple of generations in North America. But one simply looks at um, people that are white and people that are black in this country, second, third generation and beyond. Um, African Americans have 2 to 3 times um, the frequency, the population frequency of eating a vegan diet than whites do. And most people don't know that. And I think because a lot of the um, sort of well-recognized, vegan celebs and spokespeople, and probably, not all, but many of the docs and others are white. And so it comes across that way. It's not true. Many, many more, 2, 3 times African Americans are vegan than whites. And for um, Hispanic and South and East Asian populations, it's quite variable within the population, and depends on one subculture and how many generations one has been in this country. For me, it's I'm a second generation American, and grew up eating an entirely classic, horrible American diet. So those things get complicated, but just sort of a white black thing. People's perceptions are just wrong. Um, I'm a pediatrician. Eating a plant-based diet not healthy for pregnant women or children. Wrong, wrong, wrong. And that's not what today's talk is about. I'll give talks on that as well. But, um, let me just identify for now that is not true. One has to be a little careful. It's a little bit different, but it's very, very easy. And eating a whole food plant-based diet is better for a pregnant woman, better for a child, better for a fetus, a growing child in a woman's womb, and so on. Um, Most of you in the audience are undergraduates, and probably most don't have children yet. But when one is pregnant or one is raising a child, one gets an awful lot of unsolicited advice, and it gets beat up sometimes about this subject. And so a little bit of education goes a long way, but it's not true. Okay, finally, so what about nutrients? So where do you get your protein from? Calcium, iron, B12, D, omega, soy, and then we'll end with supplements. It's pretty much impossible. If you get enough calories, you just eat a typical, if you eat a plant-based diet in a well-off country, or a poor country for that matter, with just some variety of what the plants are, and everybody has some variety, and you get enough calories a day, so you're not calorie malnourished. You always get enough protein. The recommended amount of protein per adult in the U.S. is either side of 50 grams a day. It's 2 ounces. That's all. A little bit less for women, a little bit more for men. Those numbers come from federal agencies and are probably overcalled, to be cautious. And so if one ate only broccoli and got 2,000 calories a day of eating broccoli, you'd have 150 grams a day of protein, and same for beans and otherwise. So it just doesn't happen. If you eat enough calories in America and eat a plant-based diet, and even if you're not real careful, but just eat a few different kinds of food, you're not going to be protein deficient. It's the biggest misnomer ever. Then there's this thing about complete proteins. There are 20 amino acids. Many of you know this. The building blocks of protein. 8 to 10 of the amino acids are essential. That means that our body can't produce them from other nutrients. The other 10 to 12 we can produce from pretty much any food. So we have to eat those 8 or 9 or 10 amino acids. It is true that um, um, meat has all 20 amino acids because it's like us. It's in every animal being. And different plant foods tend to be missing 1 or 2 or 3 of the essential amino acids. A couple have them all, but it doesn't matter because you don't have to eat them all at the same time. As long as you're eating a few different plants, you don't have to think about it. I'm not going to give you a list because you don't have to pay attention. You always get enough of each of the essential amino acids. It is not a problem. I could say more, but we only have so much time. Protein, it's just BS, and people have this misnomer about these big hunky guys mostly, and eating half a cow, and it's ridiculous, just ridiculous. Calcium, you don't have to drink milk to get calcium. While many species eat other animals, and one can get into a long evolutionary philosophical conversation about how humans evolved in terms of eating meat, which is not the point of today's talk. We are the only species on the planet, and probably on any planet, but only species on this planet that after weaning age, 6, 12, 24 months, whatever, that's a different discussion about when a baby is weaned, from mom's milk. We are the only species that drinks the milk of another species. It's really pretty weird when you think about it. And so there's plenty of plant-based calcium sources. Green leafy vegetables, legumes are particularly high in calcium. You won't be calcium deficient by eating a whole food plant-based diet. If you're concerned that you might be a little bit close on a day-to-day basis, just have 8 ounces a day of one of the fortified plant-based milks like almond or rice or soy and so on. They typically have as much, if not more, calcium than a cow's milk. 30 to 40 to 50% of the RDA, the recommended daily allowance. You don't need to, but that has people not thinking about it. Same for iron. There is not an issue with iron and plant-based diets. Again, there's plenty of iron in green leafy vegetables. Huge amounts of iron there. Similarly, there's iron in nuts and seeds, in beans, and so on. You don't need to take an iron supplement. It's a little bit of science here, which might be of interest to you. So the iron from meat is hemoglobin iron. It's the blood of the animal that somebody would be eating. And so then we say for plant iron is non-heme iron. You need to get enough iron. If you get too much iron, it's bad. And too much iron can be inflammatory, and it can raise the risk of cancer. So one needs to get the right amount of iron, not too little, not too much. What's really interesting, at least to me, and perhaps to you, is that when one eats non-heme plant-based iron, if you are a little bit low on your total body iron, you will absorb more non-heme iron. And if you're high on your total body iron, you'll absorb much less of the non-heme iron that you're digesting. Whereas with heme iron, eating meat, humans absorb much of it, even if we have too much in our body already. It's not a problem. B12. So we have to be attentive to B12, and I'm going to try to move along that. But B12 and D are really important. B12 is really the one micronutrient, the one vitamin that we need to be attentive to as people that eat a primarily or exclusively whole food plant-based diet. It doesn't really so much come from animals so the animals like cows, when they're grazing, they eat dirt, and the B12 comes from bacteria that's in soil, and that's presumably how our ancestors used to get our B12 was from eating the plants that we just took from the soil and didn't wash it in the way that we do nowadays. Ate some bacteria from the soil, and that's how we got our B12. Nowadays, everything is so highly processed and washed, we don't get B12 from plants by and large. It's interesting that cattle that are raised as livestock in feed yards, they're given B12 because they're not getting B12 from soil. Be that as it may, if you're eating a vegan diet, um, you should take a B12 supplement once a day, unless you are very, very careful about your B12 consumption. And there are some foods, of course, that are B12 supplemented as well. And some people will say, well, I should be able to get all the B12 that I need, from nature. Well, and that's true, but we don't live in nature. We live in Boston or San Diego, and we're not eating plants from soil directly anymore. Um, so that's the one micronutrient to pay attention to. Vitamin D is a issue for vegans and non-vegans alike. Um, if you get about, say, 20 minutes of sunlight 2-3 times a week to at least expose face and arms, you'll get plenty of D. If our ancestors had the good wisdom, the good judgment not to have migrated out of East Africa, D wouldn't be a problem. In Boston in the winter, I take a D supplement, and D is probably somewhat protective for COVID, serious disease as well. D is good for us. So if you're in San Diego and you're out with shorts and a tee, 12 months of the year, you don't need to take D. But if you're covered up all the time, take D as well. Omega-3 is probably is a good fat, and it's good for us to eat some of that. It's not clear that getting omega-3 from fish oil, which is what people always talk about, is at all beneficial to health. It comes from seeds and nuts, so I get mine from chia, flaxseed. I put a little bit in my oatmeal and salads and so on every day. Also, almonds, walnuts, and so on are really good sources of omega-3. Some people think if you're a vegan, taking a seaweed or algae supplement of 3 is good for us. Science is not clear on that. Some omega-3 is good for us. And so, like I said, a little bit of seeds and nuts, walnuts, almonds, flax, chia, the ones that come to mind, do the deed for us. So what about, I already talked about dairy. So dairy is bad for us in many, many ways. And I don't really have the time to go into that, unfortunately. And it's this questions, I'll speak to that. Soy is good for us. There's this misnomer because there's organic substances in soy, phytoestrogens, that are like fourth cousins from estrogen. And so some people have hypothesized that it's bad to eat a lot of soy because it might stimulate in women, breast, ovaries, and so on. And in men, you'll pardon, get man boobs. That's all BS. It is not true. When one looks at East Asian populations, East Asian populations who did not drink milk and ate lots of soy from weaning age on, the incidence of breast cancer is dramatically less than East Asian women, second, third generation and beyond, who migrated to the West, quote unquote, and stopped eating soy and drank lots of milk. Much more breast cancer. Soy is protective. It's good for us. If you like tofu and all the rest, go for it. Supplements. So you got to pay attention to B12. And if you're not getting enough sunlight, take D, and that's it. That's the whole story. All right. Moving along then. Why don't docs do more? I'm going to, even though I'm in Boston, I grew up in New York City and Brooklyn, so I'll talk in a New York minute and be done very soon. Why don't docs do more? We don't get trained in nutrition at all. The average medical school to this day, it's no better than when I trained, gives 3 hours of nutrition education in 4 years, let alone about plant-based nutrition. Change is hard for doctors, for nurses, for patients, for everybody. Genetics, sorry, it's Darwin's fault. We evolved genetically in an environment of scarcity where our species, our ancestors, they died from not getting enough calories, not from hardening of the arteries. Docs don't know what script to write for a whole food plant-based diet, how to answer patient questions. Little support in the practice. There's not enough dietitians around, and physicians aren't trained and comfortable. And since most physicians eat lots of meat, tend not to be comfortable in discussing the subject. This will, you have the slides, so I won't spend much time here, but a number of really good organizations. Nutrition Facts, that's Gregor's organization, Blue Zones we talked about. Lighter.world is for profit and gives help and support on becoming vegan. Many, many universities have plant-based nutrition folks. Harvard's got a really good one. Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine does lots of good work. Lifestyle medicine we talked about. Planttrician Project that teaches clinicians in being plantricians. Balance.org is a place that is a great charity that I have partnered with that works to get schools, universities, and hospitals to offer more plant-based choices. If somebody wants to be an advocate in your own environment, you can talk to balance.org. You can talk to me first and I'll connect you. Wholesomewave.org is all about plant-based nutrition for marginalized and impoverished populations. And Pan USA, Pan International, that's my org, so got to show it. And then my PSA for Pan, we engage health professionals, the public, and policymakers about the role of tofu, plant-based nutrition in promoting good health and preventing and treating disease. We strive, we engender to make nutrition a key part of education, especially for medical students. We empower health professionals and others by providing evidence. Got to be evidence-based. It can't be activist stuff. Evidence-based educational material on health and whole food plant-based nutrition. And we're building a global network of the public, professionals, and scientists. It's really wonderful that we have branches in a number of European countries, and of course in the US. We're going to start one in Canada soon. We have one in South Africa and Israel, and we're working on Thailand now. And it's really for me, a really cool thing to be a part of. And we also over time want to be globally influential clinicians to promote policy change. Gregor, once again, as I wind down here, we should all be eating fruits and vegetables as if our lives depend on it, because they do. And that's me and Pan. So if you want more information, my contact info again on the bottom, pan-usa.org. And then, that's the homepage. You can also go to the contact us spot there as well. And you can just sign up to get our newsletter and otherwise plug into us. So that's a wrap. 50 minutes, 5 minutes late. Sorry about that. Better than most doctors. And I will see now if there are questions.
Dr. Kornberg.
Hey, Patrick. Yeah.
Hey, great presentation. I really appreciate all the effort you put into this. My friend Zina here, convinced me to come, and I couldn't really pay up in the beginning, but good content nonetheless. I also really appreciate the point you had about soy products and soybeans, because being Chinese myself, tofu and like soy milk and all that stuff is a big part of my diet.
Sure.
Yeah. So I was going to have a question in particular about if you had done any research regarding some specific diets that are shown to be pretty healthy but still have meat included, like say like Japanese diet, right? A lot of vegetables and a lot of grains, but also a lot of fish too, right?
Yes. Yeah. So most of the studies. I appreciate since you're of Chinese American or East Asian ancestry, and it's good. Tofu is tofu and all the rest is good for us. I mean, I've been eating more, and I'll get to your question in a minute, but I've been eating more and more truly, whole food plant-based stuff. But I'll do lots of stir fries and use seitan and tempeh and tofu, and it tastes good and it's good. But on tofu specifically, which comes up a lot in these kinds of discussions, it is good for us, not bad for us. And so when you look at, and then I'll get to the Japanese and Mediterranean diets in a minute, which will be another. When one looks at some of the studies done, where people have raised the question about, is like too much tofu, bad for those organs in our body that have estrogen receptors, if you will. So obviously, the breast and female genitalia, and then the men's breast as well. It's coming so much from a Western-oriented hypothesis that really doesn't make a lot of sense. But when it's actually studied, it's clear and compelling evidence. It's clear that eating tofu, and certainly eating tofu versus dairy, is much better for us. There's again from and I promise I will get to Japan, and I will also talk about the Mediterranean in a minute. There's Colin Campbell and his colleagues, you may know of them. One of his studies, he's out of Cornell, called it the China study, which is sort of kind of the way that, white guy he's a good guy and a brilliant scientist, but grew up in America and studied rural Chinese populations, would call his study a China study, which of course, if you were studying that from China, you wouldn't call it that. But be that as it may, looked especially at cancer, all cancers, and found that that people that eat a predominantly, whole food, plant-based diet in rural China, and with lots of tofu, have dramatically, on an age-adjusted basis, dramatically much less cancer than people in the West. And that's sort of the typical, I don't want to say nice, but productive scientific control about that, is that when you look at folks of that ancestry, so say people with your ancestry who come to the States or elsewhere in the West, but especially the US and Canada where the diets are really bad, by the third generation, people with the same genetics, but who have totally migrated to a typical American, hamburger, hot dog, double bacon cheeseburger diet, get as much cancer as somebody who came here as a slave or somebody came off the Mayflower, and very, very different than third generation ancestors in China. So to Japan, it's very similar. And I showed one of the blue zones I talked about earlier is in Japan. There's question comes up for people that eat mostly whole food diets, and what about fish? And so I will stay away from the ethics because I am here, as the scientist person. And so it is, eating a predominantly whole food plant-based diet with some significant amount of fish in it. And of course, Japanese eat a fair amount of fish traditionally. And similarly for people in the Mediterranean diet, parts of the Mideast, Greece, Southern Italy, and so on, who eat some seafood and mostly whole food plant-based. That's as protective health-wise as an entirely whole food plant-based diet. So some measure of fish is especially if it's less than 10% or so of total calories consumed, seems not to be a health issue. There are the issues around some fish and the poisons that get into the meat of fish. Mercury gets talked about a lot, and there are others like that. So that can be a problem. But in general, a whole food plant-based heavy diet with some seafood, East Asia, especially Japan and Mediterranean, is also healthy. So I hope that answered your question. I probably went well past it, Patrick, but I hope that was helpful.
No, it was very helpful. I really much appreciate it.
Hey, good to anything else today? Anybody else?
Yeah, I had one more question. So, being on like a whole food plant-based diet, I wanted to clarify, is there supposedly like a concern between organic, non-organic, as well as GMOs now that like I guess the Western world is like so developed, and as you mentioned, like everything's almost processed, including fruits and vegetables that are like GMOs?
That's a great question. I just wrote a note from me to include that in my next PowerPoints because it's a really great question. So both. So the first thing would be, and so again, I'm answering this entirely from a human health peer-reviewed study basis and not from any activist perspective at all. And around GMOs, only talking about plants. I mean, obviously on the ethical side around animals, that's a whole different space. So there is no evidence, zero nada, whatever, that GMO food is any less good for us than traditionally raised non-GMO food. There's no evidence. People may make their own choices for other reasons, but there's no scientific evidence whatsoever. And if I were to show a little bit of my own bias here, which may not resonate well with people that are undergraduates at a place like UCSD, but while not GMO, all the plants that we're eating, well, not all plants, most plants that we're eating, have wildly modified, been modified through Darwin Mendel stuff, right? Through lots and lots and lots of selection. That's not GMO, but it's not pure nature either. So anyhow, the short answer about GMO plants, there's no evidence, any study that it's harmful. So organics, it's interesting because I've started eating more organic food myself. It tends to be a little more expensive, and I'm not working in Silicon Valley. So, but I'm at this point in my life, haven't been a doc for a number of years, and I can afford to, and it's not a struggle for me. And my own personal gestalt, before I answer the question in a science way, is it's probably better to eat food that has fewer pesticides on it than food that has more of it. It just makes common sense because some of the pesticides they're bad for humans and other animals. And that's the point of them, really, when you think about it, right? And we are um, biologically more like insects than like plants, but very different. But so, having said that, of course, one of the other challenges with organic foods, some organic foods don't have as long a shelf life either, so that um, um, it can be especially more expensive if one isn't a careful and frequent shopper, which is problematic during COVID times. To the science, it's been surprising when it's been studied. Most of the evidence doesn't show that organic foods are healthier for us. You would think it would. There hasn't been a lot of studies, and probably also because we're talking some harm in the body, like animal fats and unprocessed, raw sugar kinds of stuff. The harm happens within months. So it's really easy to study that. I mean, it's bad, but it's easy to study. Whereas around the poisons that we put on crops and then aim to wash them off as much as possible to grow them as efficiently and as cheaply as possible, the harm from those probably comes over decades and generations, 10, 20, 30, 40 years. And those are really, by definition, long-term studies and really expensive studies to do. I mean, how many people that are an assistant professor, and if you don't publish enough in 5 to 7 years, you're not getting tenure. So, it's a hard study. Now, some people do the studies, but it's hard to do 10, 20-year studies and hard to get funded for it. So there hasn't been a lot of long-term studies. The evidence to date is that organic foods aren't really that much better for us. My going past the science is that it sort of kind of makes sense that it's probably safer. There's not a lot of science, so I wouldn't go crazy bending over backwards, but if you can make that work, it's probably not a bad thing. But again, there's not papers saying that explicitly. So I mixed in the science and my own, what I think is common sense, but that's just one guy talking. So hope that answered your question.
Yep, thank you.
Welcome. Well, it's been a pleasure. And for your colleagues that may look at this talk later on asynchronously, or I mean, everything's offline, everything's virtual now, but I'm used to saying offline, but you know what I mean, later. People can, you can collect them, if that you want to, or people can just email me if they have a question. I'm happy to stay in touch in whatever way is helpful. It's been a pleasure talking with you, and I wish you well in terms of sustainable planet and good health and compassion as well. So thank you.